Hey everyone. Um, Welcome to this week's Computational Typography lunch lectures. I'm really glad you're here. Leave any questions or comments you have in the chat, and also if you arrive here, let us know where you're zooming in from. While people are still joining, I thought it's good to start because we have a really exciting lecture for you today. So I just have a few household things I would like to discuss before we start, which is first of all, I want to thank a few people that helped make this happen. So first of all, the Media Lab and my RPI, Zach Lieberman, and also Dexter Callender, who is sitting actually behind me right now, helping with all the moderation. And then also very big shout out to Blair Fell, who is interpreting for us today. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here also. That's also very important, of course. Yeah, and also good to know is that these talks are being recorded. So that's, yeah, you will post them, we'll transcribe them and post them on the same website after the talks are over. Also in the, we'll have a few more talks. So today we have a talk for you, and then there will be 4 more after that. So yeah, keep an eye on the website. There's 2 things I would want to share as well. So first of all, there's an open call for a position at the Media Lab for transformative design. So I'll post the link in the chat if you know anyone that's interested in that, or if you are interested in that yourself. And then secondly, we as Future Sketches group also have an open house. So yeah, we're open. We have open applications, and we'll have a open house soon. The dates and the details will be available on our website soon. Yeah, and then I think those are the main things I wanted to mention before we start with the talk. And I'm very excited about the talk today, which is by Rossum, who yeah, he's basically actually I know him for a long time already, and he's, I think, one of the most pioneering people in the field of computational typography, which, if you can call it a field. I think he did some projects that are really changed the course of that field and are really sort of groundbreaking. And I like in his bio, he said he can be blamed for popularizing the Python programming language. So if you don't like Python, he's to blame for the tools that you might need to use. He also teaches type design at the Royal Academy in The Hague. And he develops basically a lot of different tools. A very famous one is DrawBot. It's a really great tool, Python-based tool for creative coding. And RoboFuck, he developed together with Peter van Blokland. And then currently he's been working on a really exciting project called Fontra. So yeah, I'm very excited to hear more about all of these things, and please give a big applause for Just.
Thank you. I will start with sharing my screen with the right options. Let me see how this is going. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Vera, and thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to speak in this context. One slight correction, because the popularization of Python within the field of type design was kind of my narrowing down. That was responsibility. Anyway, so that's a whole story all by itself. Anyway, thanks again for having me. I will start by saying a little something about myself. I am 57 years old and started computing when I was in my teens. And I always have to show this little slide. This tiny thing is actually a computer that you would have to hook up to your television. It's a Sinclair ZX81 from roughly the year 81. I think that indeed that model type. The thing why it's important for me is that although it's a computer, you couldn't do anything with it really except to program it in BASIC. And so I had access to this computer, and to do anything useful with it, I had to learn to program. So here we are, and that were my first steps into coding, as it's called these days. And that's been just a major part of my life ever since. Later, somehow I did not end up studying computer science or anything technical. I ended up studying graphic design. By some coincidence, that happened in The Hague, where I got type design lessons from Gerrit Noordzij, met a future friend, Erik van Blokland, with whom I collaborated a lot, especially those early years. So to start right off with an actual, the part of my story here is that programming was something that I really loved as a teenager, then started studying graphic design, which at the time seemed something completely disconnected from that passion that I had. Even though I liked graphic things, I think I liked letters at the time, even though I didn't understand much about it yet. But very soon, I think it was already in the second year or something, I more or less accidentally discovered that there's actually a very fruitful connection between coding and designing. And I started programming letter forms in a very primitive way. And luckily enough, that was very much encouraged at the KBK at the time. So that somehow gave me courage to continue with that. So anyway, after studying at KBK, I collaborated a lot with Erik van Blokland, and we kind of made our 15 minutes of fame with a typeface called Beowulf, which was a random font that is something that at the time we thought we invented that. It turns out not to be true, because actually Donald Knuth, the big Donald Knuth, actually did that probably a decade earlier or something, as he does, right? I mean, that guy just invents everything. Donald Knuth, if you haven't heard of him, check him out. He is majorly important, both in the field of typography and the field of computer science. A true legend, that is. Anyway, so we made, at the time, the PostScript language was important because it was the only way to get high quality graphics from a computer to a printer, not even to the screen so much. And fonts in that environment were effectively a piece of software themselves. We hacked up the outlines, and it turned out the PostScript language has a random number generator, so we had to use that to move all the nodes of our shapes around, and out came Beowulf. That at the time, every time you would print a letter, the same letter again, it would appear slightly different. Anyway, here's a kind of an unintended side effect was at the time we worked obviously a lot with print more than with screens. Screens were tiny and not always colorful. We discovered that if you would have color print in offset and you would have your CMYK colors and we would use this typeface for each plate, there would obviously a new rendering of the letters, and so accidentally our letters would not match up across the color plates, the color channels. We immediately embraced that accident, and when later I learned of Bob Ross's famous thing, there's no accidents, just no mistakes, just happy little accidents. That is kind of something to go by. Anyway, Beowulf, Sans, the sans serif version also exists. Fast forward a couple decades, doing many type design work, doing lots of programming work, doing lots of Python work. At some point, I got a little bit in a situation where I wasn't really enjoying the coding all that much anymore. I was kind of like, we're kind of, well, a crisis is way too big a word. Anyway, I had developed DrawBot, a relatively simple program in which, inspired by design by numbers, inspired by processing. So there's a direct link to the MIT Media Lab there. I was lucky over the years to meet John Maeda at some point in the 90s. Anyway, I'm digressing. DrawBot, a Python-based tool to make 2D graphics using simple Python code. The tool initially was rather primitive until 2013, when my former student Frederik Berlaan took over and rewrote, I would say, 90% of the application and actually made it pretty good. And I started having some more fun with it, and I started to make some exercises, and this is one of the first thing I did. One of the features that Frederik managed to add to DrawBot is to have a video export, or initially just animated GIF. DrawBot is not a real-time tool at all. You cannot really compare it to processing or pre-5JS. It's really kind of a slow thing. But anyway, with using some 2D graphics and programming your frames for an animation and exporting them either as video or as animated GIF, I could experiment with moving things. So this was one of those first experiments where I pretty much drew a series of squares, somewhat distorted, and figured out some way of making them rotate, and accidentally bumped into this thing where those lines that all have the same thickness all over, when they are spaced like this, you get this kind of spacey, this kind of shadowy effect, which was completely unintentional, but again, it looks pretty nice. So I embraced that, and I posted this online, and people say, hey, you should post this somewhere. So at the time I started a visual blog on Tumblr, the Daily DrawBot, which was daily for maybe a couple months, then became weekly, then became monthly, then became yearly, and probably right now is decadely. Anyway, how these things go. I will just zap through some of the examples of those exercises that I did, pretty much for fun. I was having fun using simple math to determine movement. The thing is, with DrawBot, you really have to program the frames yourself, and you have to come up with the logic, like how do things move from one frame to the next. There were no tools like Cavalry. So for me, this was just a really nice thing to really dig into the basics of using simple math to make things move. And with DrawBot being the primitive tool that it is, it doesn't help much in making fancy graphics. It's pretty much a 2D graphics engine. The graphics primitives that are available are pretty much borrowed from the PDF format. So it is vector based internally. We can export pixels or vector stuff. Anyway, as part of the experimentation, sometimes people would show me things from the past, or I would come across things on Instagram, and I would think, this nice old bit of design looks actually pretty, well, not similar, but has a kind of vibe of the kind of things that I was programming. So someone suggested here, like, hey, this looks like one of your things, and maybe and then I thought, yeah, but maybe it should move. So this is a famous bit of design by Wim Krauwel and a co-worker of his. It's so the name says Peter Struiken. Peter Struiken is a famous Dutch pioneer in computational art. What we see here is not by Peter Struiken. This is like the cover of a catalog for an exhibition. So this graphic we see here was done by Krauwel and his collaborator. So I pretty much remade this. the cool thing about this particular thing is that the logic of movement is entirely embedded in how this was done. And if you look closely and study the rhythm, the patterns, it is completely logical, and how to make it move. There's just no ambiguity. I didn't have to interpret anything. Pretty much this was my interpretation of it, but it's pretty literally just what the graphic from, I think, the 60s prescribed. So that's kind of a fun thing to work on. I did a couple of more things. So someone else suggested to me, hey, do you know Marcel Duchamp's anemic cinema experiments from the 20s? And I did not know that at the time, looked at it, and that's there were some pretty nice experiments. So this is pretty much just a turntable of a static graphic that is rotating, that gives the illusion of movement. So so of course I had to go and just rewrite it. So this is just the same thing. It's just a static image that rotates around a center point. However, after having written the code to reproduce this, I could also change the rules and make it not a static image. So I kind of made a variation where it's more dynamic. I'm not saying this is an improvement over the original, but it was kind of fun to see what would happen just by applying different rules to the similar visual elements. Likewise, at some point, I got a fascination for 3D, and also actually the math of 3D. I was not super, like in the 90s, I had done some work with 3D modeling tools. However, I was not really interested in that at that particular moment. I was really interested in, like, how do 3D coordinates work? How do you do math with them? How can you transform? How can you, if you have like a series of 3D XYZ coordinates that together describe a form, how can you project that onto a 2D screen? Or how can you make it rotate? Or how can you make, anyway, so I started doing things that are relatively primitive in terms of graphic output. For me, were more about learning the math, and pretty much, again, still using DrawBot. So we're having this vector model, and we don't have shading or lighting, anything like that. We just have a way to output vector graphics. For instance, this is a doodle made out of cubic Bezier curves, but instead of 2D, so pretty much made with random numbers. But instead of two-dimensional numbers, I used three-dimensional numbers, and then rotated those. And the curve is actually applied after the projection to 2D. So pretty much rotating the coordinates and throwing away the Z coordinates, and then drawing the curves. And well, by having the rotation being this kind of smooth thing, it kind of gives this illusion of a three-dimensional thing. Likewise here, this is all still done in DrawBot, even though DrawBot really doesn't help much in doing this thing. And this was kind of a discovery is a big word, and I'm also sure it's not unique in how it's made. This was actually based, like, how to draw a spiral on a sphere. I actually found some example code on the internet, some JavaScript code that I managed to translate to Python, so I didn't have to fully understand. I mean, I'm okay with math, but I'm definitely no math genius. So I am very grateful to live in these days where you can just look up everything on the internet and find example code in popular programming languages. Anyway, to illustrate how this was actually done, with DrawBot being this primitive tool, is this. We kind of it's built out of a lot of circles that are drawn from back to front and giving that are given a color shade based on the imaginary Z coordinates, like the 3D thing. So by reducing the number of circles here, you kind of get a visual explanation of how that previous thing was done. So it's all pretty much an illusion. It's by no means an efficient way to create 3D graphics, but it was fun to play with. Similarly, I wanted to know more about how Perlin noise works, and especially in a 3D form. So I kind of I have another example, a more recent one that kind of takes this idea to produce three-dimensional forms based on this noise stuff. So this is all, again, like calculated in 3D, but simply flattened into onto a 2D. It's pretty much a wireframe graphic. Likewise, then, of course, I like letters, so maybe I should program some more letters was at some point the idea. And by coming up with some boxy way to define a three-dimensional letter, also parametrically, you kind of, if you look closely here, the box that this shape forms changes in dimension. The letter E gets thinner and thicker, and pretty much tangential to this, I wanted to learn how to intersect a surface in 3D with a three-dimensional object. So this was, in a way, also for me a math exercise. Like, can I figure out if I have a flat surface? Wait, what is the correct name for that? Anyway, fields, no, just a flat thing in 3D space, and I use that to slice a three-dimensional object. Again, this becoming some sort of wireframe. Then I could actually, if I would sort the resulting shapes in the right form and would draw them with this PDF-like shadow function. So again, there's no 3D tool involved here. It's just like the DrawBot has this very primitive shadow function that kind of is meant for blurry drop shadows. But if you just draw these things in the right order, you can kind of give the illusion as if there's something 3D going on. So of course, there's actual 3D math going on to prepare this, but the rendering engine, this is all pretty much straight from a PDF-like engine. Then sometimes things do not have to move. Recursive algorithms, always nice. I was trying to make recursive letters, and this was the most successful attempt to that, like an H, a slap serif H, and each serif becomes another H, and this goes on until the end. Of course, like within, so this was, it's actually still available as a poster from Typotake. And since it's code, you can mess it up with random numbers. But like within a few months of this coming out as a poster at Typotake, I got a message, or maybe posting it on that the Bird platform. Someone showed me, someone else had actually invented the exact same principle, like obviously years before me. So that's kind of what happens. I mean, I don't. So yeah, the best ideas are generally already taken, but let that not stop you from just making stuff. Anyway, so yeah, for me, the making of things is often, well, almost therapeutic. If I'm lucky, I make something that afterwards can be explained with a nice concept, but the kind of designer that I am, that I still kind of am, I kind of transformed more into a programmer, engineer rather than a designer. It's not that I do no design work, but I mostly do programming work these days. But okay, I already lost my train of thought here. Yeah, to just make things without a fixed concept beforehand is for me really nice, and I'm not waiting for inspiration or to come up with this perfect concept and then start making things. I think it's really important, like, especially if you're stuck, if you don't know what to do next, just start drawing, start making, and something will come out. And you know, concepts sometimes are in this whole creative process are sometimes perhaps a little overrated. I mean, not unimportant. Anyway, let's continue. So DrawBot was originally meant as an educational tool and still used as such. I use it at Type Media to teach our that's our master course in The Hague, where people come to study for a year to specialize in type design. For quite a while, I also taught at the graphic design department. That's how I know Vera. I taught Vera a little bit of Python back then with DrawBot. And here, so the programming can be very well these days. Things are different, and I bet I'm preaching to the choir here. But for a long time, programming was a fairly seemingly abstract thing to do and difficult, involves math and blah blah blah. So things to make it visual, and I think designed by numbers by John Maeda and processing, of course, also coming from that same kind of thinking, is really helpful for visually oriented people. So likewise, since within type design, Python has become important for us, it's important to teach our students Python specifically, because there's all kinds of tools available if they know a bit of Python. So having DrawBot as this relatively simple environment where you could type a little bit of code, mess up, and hopefully get some immediate visual results, hopefully indeed gets some people on board of the whole coding thing that otherwise might have been scared away. How successful it is, that still very much depend on the people. I'm glad that this whole processing obviously became hugely prolific and popular. So there's obviously something about this. And indeed, so here I want to go through, it's pretty much a random selection of some former students from Type Media from the year class of 2016. Of people that really had no coding background at all when they started, and still used some logic, some math to create things that, well, sometimes moved, sometimes not. This is a particularly spectacular interpretation of the Calypso typeface, which comes from the metal from the letterpress era, but somehow is just so suitable to make it move. And Mark Roro really had a nice little project here to make this font come to life on the screen. Anyway, likewise, to experiment maybe with serif shapes, to kind of parameterize your design, to kind of turn your ideas into numbers. Design by numbers, here we go for the third time, but it's I think a really useful thing for students to explore things in addition to all the other things that they do, right? I mean, I see at Type Media the coding lessons, and they also get lessons in stone carving, they get lessons in calligraphy, and they get lessons in coding, and I don't see those things at all that different from one another. Like, not everyone will become a professional stone carver. Not everyone will become a professional coder after this, after Type Media, but all of those things have some influence on what these people become and what they take home with them after they graduate. So anyway, I'm always fascinated to see what happens when this was. Yeah, of course, I've been picking out some really exceptional ones. Bart Vollebrecht has now been working at Studio Dunbar as a type designer, but Studio Dunbar has been doing lots of motion design. Bart has been bringing his type design expertise to that studio, but this is something he did while still at Type Media, already showing a very impressive knack for this way of thinking and working. Even though, yeah, mathematically it's not super complicated. I don't want to diminish it in any way, but it's just delightful how with some relatively simple tools he came up with some super original looking works. Anyway, let's see, how much time do I have? So some other things from the past. Okay, going a little bit back in time. Luna Mauder from Moniker Studio these days, back then had the commission to make a corporate identity for a foundation that unfortunately folded a couple of years ago, STIM, this Foundation for Electronic Improvised Music, in Dutch Stichting Elektronische Improviseerde Muziek. So this foundation helped sound artists with studio space and well, development in general. Luna Mauder came up with an identity based on tape, just Scotch tape to make letter forms. realized then to make everything really with those letter forms. It was the concept behind this. Here there was actually a concept from the start that was pretty great, as is what some people like Luna are really especially good at. Like there was a do-it-yourself concept behind this, because this foundation didn't have a lot of money. It was important that they would be given a system, a design system that they could then themselves make stuff with. So the original idea was, here, just use tape and make letters for your posters and your window displays for shows, etc. Soon realized that maybe this is a little bit more work than is practical. So she asked me and Eric to think, like, can we maybe automate this and turn this into a tool that the people can use there? So that's what we did. So we made a tool where you can type a text. These days, this would definitely be a web tool, but back then we made a DrawBot-like tool. This is all written in Python and Mac OS only. But there's a couple of parameters, and there's some things we can do. I already made it. Let's. It will be too slow already. So anyway, so we have a starting point with tape. So Eric drew this kind of center line alphabet that we can apply a tape effect to, but then we make additional. The rules were, and those were invented by Luna, that you make parallel bits of tape and do that several times over. And then there are rules of how those pieces of tape could grow, extend, and be cut off. So like there's really this process to it where you push some buttons. It's a toy to play with, and that will then give something. And because it's done with tape and it's done as one graphic, it really becomes a piece around the actual text. So it is really responding to the letters. In a way, it becomes lettering that way. It's not strictly typography. Let me try to make, okay, so we can change. Let me just play a little bit, or maybe even start over a little bit, do some randomize effect and some rotate effect, spawn, grow. Let's see, do it again. I mean, these actions that I'm clicking now, it was really meant to just play around, but you could record these things and kind of copy the process and apply the same rules to other text. It's getting a bit slow now because I actually did pretty thin strokes. I can do thicker. There's some stuff with color we can play with. Anyway, and then you can export it as PDF or whatever and make your poster or make whatever else with it. All right. So yeah. So on the one hand, a fancy tool, but they've actually used it internally to make their own things and did all kinds of things with it that were unintended. And that's the cool thing about it. With their it got a use that we didn't foresee per se. So that's always a nice thing to happen when something you make is actually done, used in ways that that you didn't foresee. Anyway, I did not quite similar, but V2 in Rotterdam is a similar kind of foundation institute focused around video. They call it the Lab for the Unstable Media, which is a nice poetic name. They've existed for a very long time. But in 2017, I got to design a dynamic logo for them, which they got a tool that they could manipulate themselves. In a way, it's a variable logo. It's not literally a variable font, but there's a whole bunch of parameters that they can play with. And I turned some of that in animations. So it's pretty much only the letters V2 and an underscore, and that's their logo. That already was their logo, but I made new letters for them that were programmed. I'm just slowly going through some variations that were possible in black and white. There's also contrast possible, and so they actually got the tool so they can make their own variations, and they've been using it ever since. So also it's possible to use it in layers. There were some special effects. My youngest son this morning called these cucumber letters because of the color with, no, he said gherkin, which the pickle letters. That's the correct translation, I suppose, which I could not disagree with. Anyway, last pickle letters. Yeah, also some slightly moving animation for the subtitles. Let me see. I am running out of time. So one actually fairly big thing I did from that moment on, from 2007, I worked with Hansje van Halen, a very prolific typographic designer from Amsterdam. This is, if you haven't heard of her, which I would be surprised to hear, but check her out. That's it's she's making amazing work. Her work is very digital, and she uses a lot of Illustrator, but she does that in a way where often you really cannot tell how it's done. So but there's I mean, she's using some plugins and she worked with some custom things. She used the scriptographer stuff from Jörg Leni at some point. Anyway, I had met her through KBK at some point. We had a little chat, and I naively asked her, "Hey, in your work, is there any coding involved?" And she was kind of like, "No," and I was kind of surprised because I had no idea how she did all that work. This is her presenting the Lowlands project back in 2017. Anyway, I got to work with her because she got a huge commission for a music festival called Lowlands in the Netherlands. It's, I think, the largest in the Netherlands. It's a 3-day, one of those typical big, large-scale music festivals where people camp and get muddy if it rains. Hansje got the commission pretty much carte blanche, like do whatever you like. The people who ran the festival were huge fans of her work and trusted whatever she did. I will go through some earlier versions, and at some point she realized, okay, so this is what's kind of initially in 2017 what she came up with, and she fairly soon realized that, okay, this is actually very laborious to make. If I have to do this, I mean, she was used to making maybe book covers, posters, and some environmental stuff. I mean, relatively large-scale cultural things, but now for this huge festival, a huge amount of stuff would have to be produced. So she suddenly remembered our conversation, the conversation that I had with her a couple of years prior, and asked like, hey, can we maybe talk? I have this thing which might be programmable and automatable, and therefore might make it possible to actually make the designs that I have in my head. And so it went, and she showed me these things, and I know relatively well how Illustrator works, I think, yet I couldn't just guess like how she did this. So we sat together and she showed me all the steps, and I wrote down like how she did it, and in the end I ended up indeed coding up all the steps she did manually and made a system that we could then use to produce these effects more quickly. We kind of industrialized her process to some extent, and it was just this first year. It was very black and white, very stripy. It was amazing to see it used in like these big screens. And the second year, so I'm going to show some highlights. It evolved a lot. If you look at it today, you wouldn't recognize anything from this anymore. So in 2018, there was already a lot more color involved. Just to give you an impression of the amount of stuff. I mean, she also got to design some really abstract things. So she hired a collaborator who also worked a lot on these designs. So yeah, from official festival merchandise, passes, wristbands, video stuff. So at this moment, there was another collaborator entering. I think he started in 2018. Juriaan Hos, a fantastic motion designer, joined Hansje in designing these things, and somehow with my code and his vision about animation and ways of post-processing, we ended up with this kind of wild stuff that at the time we were looking at this, like the three of us, Hansje, Juriaan, and me, we were like thinking that none of us could have done this individually, and it's kind of hard to tell who is literally responsible for what here. So anyway, but this is an evolving thing. here a huge tent that was made already that first year. Those shapes went through the algorithms that I helped make. That's the shapes in orange on black here. That's kind of this weird fuzzy feeling that I get, like there's some sound here, and that's not completely necessary. Anyway, later on, which year is this? We developed a new typeface and a new way of using this stripy thing. So this is kind of was a relatively logic next step, all driven by Hansje with her ideas. Using similar technology. So I wrote code that would run in DrawBot that Hansje would then also use herself and her coworkers to produce these things. Some of this was also used by the web builders. The website for Lowlands is built by the Fabriek agency. For a long time, they also actually had some code running on their websites to produce banners. Anyway, this is yet another evolutionary step in this thing, or this was some in between. I don't think these were used. Yeah, then COVID happened and the festival did not happen for 2 years, even though the actual cancel moment was always a little tight. A lot of stuff had already been produced. So Hansje had already had all the visuals pretty much lined up of how things should look. Okay, good. And now we're ending at last year. So I unfortunately don't have some decent stuff to show from this year. So my contribution in last year and today, this year is mostly a font that is used a lot. So the graphics are now produced in a different way. There's different motion. If you're interested in how it looks today, go to lowlands.nl to see what it looks like now. Anyway, so this font that I made more or less based on Hansje's ideas is pretty much overlaying a normal typeface onto a grid and then slowly moving the grid around. So we made, I think this font has 18 alternates for each letter. And what you're looking at here is a screen capture from the website as it was at the time. Unfortunately, I was looking for it. I had to actually grab this from the Wayback Machine because they don't archive their own old websites. So this is on that website from 2022. It was actual text. It was animated by just a tiny amount of JavaScript. It's not a super high frame rate or anything. And this worked relatively efficiently. It would even work on low-end mobile devices. And even though it animates in a very cute way, it's still completely text. So it's not video. It's still completely scalable. Anyway, I was really happy with how this turned out. It's relatively illegible, and Lowlands is getting a lot of complaints about that. It's also used in static form. So some of the variants are more legible than others, but. Okay, next project, I collaborated with my partner Alexandra in 2019, Alexandra Samolenkova, working forward, continuing on something she had done earlier with some coding. She made a zigzag typeface that could also be used in loops. And there was this idea that, and then she experimented a bit further and then suggested to collaborate and bring this forward. We made an experimental by invitation of Tipo Yanchi, an organization in Korea that invited us that year to participate in an experimental variable font festival. So we made a variable font with a lot of axes. In the end, it only has like a handful of letters. It can spell 2 words, the word Liana in English and the word Liana in Cyrillic. This font turned out to be super huge and big. We are still thinking like, how can we turn this into something more practically? We love the effect, and but are still working on like, how can we turn this into a practical thing that can work with a full character set. So we made I made a custom RoboFont extension to experiment with the settings with the algorithm. So it's partially drawn, partially algorithm. It's a nice combination of these two things. I'm going to skip Font Goggles. It's a font tester viewer for macOS. Fontgoggles.org is where you can download it. You can play with fonts, check out OpenType features. I will briefly show last year's project that I did together with Arthur Reinders-Vormer. prolific color font designer. We were invited by Google Fonts to propose a color font for the new Color V1 font format. Arthur came up with this idea, and I helped realize it with code. So this is a variable font with two axes. We can change the depth of this 3D effect, and the other axis is about the highlight thing. Different color palettes are built into the font. It doesn't work on all platforms yet, but it's exciting technology where you can have gradients in the fonts. I set up a workflow where Arthur could draw this in a relatively flat shape, and I had code to make the extrusion and the 3D effect, which he could then also use to preview what would happen. Anyway, another small project from last year, I was asked by Commercial Type to make a digital marbled, kind of marbled effect that was not supposed to look like really marbled, but and it was. I will show you. It was done for this the Arabic display extension of the Lyon typeface from Commercial Type. The Lyon Latin was done by Kai Bernal. The Arabic extension was done by Marcos KJ Apelian, and but this poster project here you see a printed version. The background was programmed by me, and it was meant since it's the Arabic is like a modern digital interpretation of relatively classic forms, and apparently marbled backgrounds on Arabic calligraphy is a traditional thing. They had the idea, like, please make something that is somewhat related to marbledness, but is not but still somehow digital. I will show you. This is, of course, we had an animated version in addition to the printed static one. This is kind of a close-up of the same thing before it got colorized. Double check. I'm almost out of time. Time to break up. So the last thing I wanted to show, and it can be various, the main project that I'm working on at the moment. This is maybe the most boring thing in the whole thing, but I'm working a lot. I've been collaborating with Black Foundry in Paris for the last close to 3 years probably. And one of the things I'm working on is a new font editor that runs in a web browser, and I would. If the technology allows. Okay, so here I'm looking at at a font. I mean, and you can click around, and we can. Well, it's really focused around a variable font technology. We can have live interpolation. You can see this particular font has a bunch of masters, but we can kind of edit things and then immediately see how that change would respond in the interpolation to other weights. So this is a relatively advanced. We're quite far. It's not completely done for general use. It's an open source thing. I will show the URL later on. It's something that I put a lot of thought and love in. It's less about creative coding, but it's more like hardcore coding. Yeah, I wanted to make the point. Creative coding, isn't that like a superfluous addition? Like, in my opinion, every coding is creative. So the word creative coding is a little, maybe not so, maybe not so, well, we need a word anyway. But anyway, thank you for your attention. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Vera and Zach Lieberman for having me. There's still some time for questions in the chat if Vera or anyone else would like to moderate them.
Yeah. Big applause for Just. Thank you so much. This was so amazing.
Thank you.
Oh wow. So please, if you have any questions for Just, post them in the chat. We have we have to stop in 5 minutes. But we have a little bit more time, and I'm sure you have so many questions for Just. While you have time to post, I'll briefly give an overview of some household things that I want to share for 1 minute. So thank you everyone for helping with this, and we have, after today's talks, we have 4 more, so please tune in. We record everything, so you'll be able to see it on the website too. We have 2 open calls on the Media Lab website, one for faculty with tenure track, and one for applications for students in our Future Sketches group. So if anyone has, so there's a lot of questions already that happened, and it's hard to choose which one to begin with. But there was one question by Antonina, which I think was interesting. She asked if you usually invent the idea first and calculate the thing you want to make, or if you sort of experiment with code. So if you actually sketch in code as well.
Yeah, a good question that I already tried to answer a little bit during the talk. Yeah, so sketch code has this peculiarity that you cannot just bang on the keyboard and get something working, right? You can do that with pencils and with brushes and all kinds of analog stuff. With code, it has to have a minimal amount of neatness and grammar correctness before you can do anything at all. That said, I do indeed play with things. I often start with something small and just try to see where it could be going, especially in these things that could be covered by the creative coding word. So yeah. Like I said,
Nice.
yeah, sometimes I have an idea, and sometimes it's nice if someone suggests, like back then when I have this period of making these little animated loops, when someone would suggest something that was for me always a little often. I mean, I didn't take on all the challenges, but some of those challenges were really nice because then there's something that I can just code and I don't have to think of any idea. It's just there. It will be an homage to that original thing. We will reference that, and that's for me also a very satisfying thing.
Mm.
Yeah,
that's very nice. I also wonder, so Sarah also asked, and I think you answered, I mean, I think actually most of the questions that people asked, you also answered, but just good to hear more.
Can be reworded?
Yeah, just more to hear like more insight. So she also asked, so if you work, we've seen your personal work and we've seen some of your more corporate work. So she wondered how you set up branding guidelines or boundaries if you work for these programs. So how do you define these rules?
Okay, yeah, okay. I feel that I've been in the situation with Lowlands. I mean, it was all in the hands of Hansje van Hallem, and I would bring in creative possibilities, but I had no responsibility in terms of design systems. Like for this V2 logo, I pretty much, the program has a fairly limited scope. It can, but what they wanted to do with this was also mostly up to them. I suggested a text typeface that they could use, but in terms of color use, well, they like the color green, so I think they went with green stuff. Other than that, they pretty much do what they want. So in that sense, I'm not a brand designer. I don't feel like that. That's not what I'm good at. I mean, if I can help people, yeah, there's a fun thing. Let's see if I can, in terms of creative things, those free things where I occasionally make them, and around 2015, 16, 17, I had like this streak of things that a pretty constant flow of stuff that I just made. That felt kind of liberating, and it was very nice to just do whatever I want. And I had this kind of format. It has to be a loop, and I want it to be mathematically perfect, that it loops without any breaks. So that was kind of the challenge I tended to set me. So those things were relative. I got some likes and some retweets, whatever. And at some point, we even got some questions from potential clients, like, "Hey, could you maybe make something like, we love your work, and can we do something?" That I took on a couple of those things. And for me, I generally don't mind at all to work for clients. I love working for clients. I love to work within limits, but somehow this, for me, was extremely difficult. So I, in one case, I literally failed. I mean, they did nicely, paid what they promised, but the thing that I made was not published because indeed it was, yeah, I understood why they didn't go for it. So yeah, that is this. So apparently, like the creative coding in commission, it's not that I haven't done it at all, but it's for me really hard to do successfully. Because then, yeah, then, well, no,
yeah,
I cannot really
yeah,
explain.
it's a difficult process to combine code
Yeah.
and the design process, I can imagine.
So for
But
instance,
good to
then
hear your thoughts.
then more regular or boring engineering tasks that I have far less problems with, maybe because it's more technical or something. I know on one hand, I'm just kind of an engineer that's anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we have time for one question. It's really difficult to pick one because there's so many good ones, but I think one that could be one that I would like to know, and also having had you as a teacher, is what is your favorite pieces of advice for students that you teach?
Okay, I had, I was recently talking to my oldest son who is studying architecture, and I suddenly remembered a bit of advice that my dad gave to me, and I think that's still valid. And he said something like, once you graduate and you start working for studios, don't stick around too long. Kind of try to move to your next opportunity and develop. Don't get glued into this comfortable position. That's kind of the takeaway.
Don't get too comfortable.
It's in the end, the way my career evolved right after I graduated, it somehow accidentally went that way anyway. It's not that I super focused on following that advice or something, but and also, it's don't know, maybe go ahead if you have a follow-up. I have no ending of this sentence.
I think that's a very good advice to end on. Just
maybe
thank you so much.
One more thing while we're at it. So because I think like what I experienced, what I keep on mentioning, this streak of creativity that I had from 2015, 16, 17, that I pretty much showed the world what I loved to do, and that actually brought in work. So the creative coding things were not really my thing, as it turned out. But I got other connections, like the connection with Hansje van Hanem. Even though I had met her, the fact that she saw these things that I made gave her confidence. Like, hey, that maybe indeed that kind of technology works for my project. So to just kind of show what you love to do will be fruitful, and just kind of try to. Yeah, that's what I try to tell students. Like, of course, you have to make a living, but somehow I think it helps if it shines through that what you do, that you actually enjoy it. Of course, it's not graphic design is your passion, or it's not a hobby, right? We're professionals. You have to pay the bills. That is a very important part. But still, if there's some conviction in like the way you present your works, that is definitely beneficial. That's I've noticed that. So yeah, late in my career, right? So I had this kind of up. My career went a bit like this and that, and something. I never needed much money to live. But the last maybe 8 years or something have been a really nice boost of my career somehow, thanks to whatever circumstances, and also maybe just finding this stuff that I really like. So it's never too late to kind of bend your career in some way, one way or another.
And do what you love. That's very good advice. Yes, thank you so much. I wish we had like 2 more hours to talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
So insightful, and thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. Let's give just one more round of applause, and I hope you all have a great day.